The observation windows of Kepler 7 station stretched floor to ceiling, offering a vista of the Horsehead Nebula that had inspired 1,000 doctoral theses and twice as many bad poems. Dr. Elias Reeves stood before 300 of the galaxy's finest minds, his presentation hovering in holographic splendor behind him, and felt the particular thrill that came from knowing he was the smartest person in the room. "The fundamental error," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the acoustically perfect hall, "is assuming that intelligence correlates with aesthetic familiarity. We see a face that resembles our own and project competence. We see something other and assume primitive. It's colonial thinking wrapped in a lab coat." Appreciative murmurs rippled through the audience. Elias caught sight of Dr. Yuki Tanaka in the third row, nodding with that expression she wore when she was already mentally drafting her agreement for the peer review. He permitted himself a small smile. "Take, for instance, the Andromedans." He gestured, and the hologram shifted to display a vaguely squid-like being. "Humanity's first contact. We nearly started a war because our diplomats couldn't stop staring at the tentacles. Never mind that they've been broadcasting poetry across subspace for 3 centuries. Never mind that their mathematics made ours look like a child's counting game. We saw calamari and thought monsters." Laughter scattered through the hall, the comfortable kind that came from people enjoying their own enlightenment. A hand rose in the back, beneath one of the observation windows where the nebula's rose-gold light made everyone look vaguely heroic. The figure was slight, draped in a nondescript gray cloak with a deep hood. Station environmental controls kept the temperature at a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, making the heavy covering an odd choice. "Yes," Elias said, not bothering to hide his impatience. Questions this early usually meant someone hadn't read the pre-circulated materials. "You advocate for cultural relativism in aesthetic judgment." The voice was female, measured, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "But doesn't that position itself become a kind of aesthetic, a preference for the preferenceless? Aren't you simply substituting one bias for another?" Elias felt his colleagues shifting in their seats, that particular academic tension that preceded either brilliance or spectacular embarrassment. He allowed the pause to extend, letting the question hang just long enough to seem worthy of consideration. "An interesting philosophical exercise," he said finally, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "However, there's a difference between advocating for conscious awareness of bias and claiming bias doesn't exist. I'm not suggesting we pretend everyone is equally beautiful, I'm suggesting we stop pretending beauty has anything to do with capability." He smiled, the patient expression he used on undergraduate freshmen. "The distinction might seem subtle, but it's rather crucial to the entire thesis. Perhaps a review of the foundational texts might clarify." Someone in the front row, Dr. Marcus Wu from the Titan Institute, actually snickered. The hooded figure said nothing, but Elias noticed her posture change. Where before she had leaned slightly forward, now she sat perfectly still, the kind of stillness that reminded him of the moments before storms on Earth, when even the air seemed to be holding its breath. He continued his presentation, warming to his theme. The next slide showed comparative neural scans from a dozen species, demonstrating the foolishness of equating brain structure with cognitive function. He made a joke about humans being unnecessarily symmetrical for our own good that landed well. By the time he reached his conclusion, a rousing call for the Interstellar Academic Council to implement blind review processes for all xenocultural research, he'd almost forgotten the woman in the back. Almost. She sat through the applause without moving, a gray shadow against the cosmic backdrop. When the formal presentation ended and people began rising, clustering into conversational groups, she remained seated. Elias found his attention drawn to her repeatedly as he fielded congratulations and deflected invitations to dinner with practiced ease. "Brilliant as always," said Dr. Kavitha Sharma, her silver hair catching the nebula light. "Though you were rather hard on that poor woman." "Was I?" Elias accepted a glass of wine from a passing service drone, one of the simple hovering spheres that Kepler 7 used for basic hospitality. "I thought I was rather gentle." She asked a freshman philosophy question. I gave a freshman philosophy answer. She asked a rather good question, actually. Good questions require understanding the material first. Kavitha raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, drifting away to join another cluster of scholars. Elias found himself scanning the room again. The hooded woman had finally risen and was moving along the peripheral of the hall, keeping to the shadows near the observation windows. Something about the way she moved suggested grace, perhaps training in low-gravity environments where every gesture had to be controlled. He told himself he wasn't curious. She was nobody, a hanger-on, perhaps someone's assistant who'd been given a courtesy seat. The symposium always had a few of those, people filling spaces, occupying chairs meant for minds that mattered. The reception was scheduled for the observation deck, one level up, where the caterers had promised something called fusion cuisine that supposedly incorporated delicacies from 7 different species. Elias had low expectations but high hopes for the Centaurian whiskey that was rumored to be on offer. The observation deck of Kepler-7 had been designed by someone who understood that humans needed beauty the way they needed oxygen. The transparent floor gave the impression of walking on starlight, the nebula swirling beneath their feet in slow-motion majesty. Elias stood near the western curve of the deck, surrounded by a half-circle of colleagues who laughed at his stories with the enthusiasm of people who knew their names would appear in his acknowledgments. So the Betelgeusian diplomat looks at the entire buffet, Elias said, timing his pause perfectly, and says, I asked for finger food, not food made of fingers. The laughter came right on cue. Dr. Wu nearly choked on whatever purple thing he'd been brave enough to sample from the fusion menu. Even stern Professor Adelaide Grant cracked a smile, which Elias considered a personal victory. The service drones hummed overhead, their anti-gravity generators creating a barely perceptible vibration that Elias had long since learned to ignore. One descended near him, offering a tray of drinks that shifted colors in the nebula light. He selected something amber and took a sip, finding it pleasantly smoky. The problem with xenocultural studies, he continued, emboldened by the whiskey and the attention, is that half the field is still treating aliens like exotic pets. Oh, look at the interesting customs. How charming that they eat with their feet. Never mind asking why, or what philosophical framework informs the practice. Just take a picture and write a paper about how diverse the universe is. You make it sound so mercenary, Adelaide said, though her tone suggested agreement rather than challenge. It is mercenary. We're tourists with tenure. More laughter, and Elias felt that warm expansion in his chest that came from being precisely where he belonged, saying exactly what needed to be said, to people who understood his brilliance. Then the gray cloak appeared at the edge of his vision. She'd been moving through the reception like a ghost, pausing at different conversation clusters but never quite joining them. Now she stood perhaps 3 meters away, near a sculptural piece that some optimistic artist had titled Convergence, a tangle of metal that was supposed to represent unity but mostly represented poor welding. Elias pretended not to notice her, launching into another anecdote about a disastrous first contact mission to the Proxima system. But he could feel her attention like heat, and it irritated him the way a pebble in a shoe irritated, small but impossible to ignore. Finally, she moved closer. The hood still obscured most of her face, though he caught a glimpse of pale skin and what might have been dark hair. Dr. Reeve, she said, and her voice cut through his story like a scalpel through tissue paper. I wanted to follow up on your presentation. The conversation around him didn't exactly stop, but it dampened, people half turning to see who had interrupted. Of course, Elias said, his smile tight. Though this is a reception, not a seminar. Perhaps we could schedule office hours when we're back at our respective institutions. I don't think that will be necessary. My question is simple. She stepped forward, and the ambient light from the nebula caught the edge of her jaw, the curve of her neck. You spoke about the danger of aesthetic bias in evaluating intelligence. Yet your entire presentation rested on human frameworks, human philosophy, human historical examples. Isn't that itself a kind of bias? The assumption that human intellectual tradition is the lens through which all understanding must be filtered. Elias felt his colleagues watching. Dr. Wu had stopped eating. Adelaide had gone very still. Human frameworks, Elias said slowly, are what this symposium is built on. We're the Interstellar Academic Symposium, not the Interstellar Academic Democracy. Someone has to organize the conversation, establish baseline terminology, create shared reference points. That happens to be us. If you find that problematic, perhaps you should publish a counter-framework and see if it gains traction. He delivered the last line with a smile, the kind that took the edge off while keeping the blade sharp. Published something worth reading, you mean, she said quietly. I didn't say that. You implied it rather clearly. Someone behind Elias cleared their throat. The service drones continued their placid hovering, oblivious to the tension. Look, Elias said, and he could hear the patience fraying in his own voice, I don't know who you are, or which institution gave you a guest pass to this symposium, but the observation deck at a reception is not the place for academic debate. If you have genuine concerns about methodological bias in xenocultural studies, submit a paper. Go through peer review like everyone else. Don't ambush people at cocktail parties because you didn't understand a lecture. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but really, who was this woman? Standing there in her ridiculous cloak, challenging him in front of his peers, acting as though she had the credentials to question his work. For a long moment, she said nothing. The nebula turned beneath their feet, indifferent and eternal. Then, with a movement so deliberate it seemed choreographed, she reached up and grasped the edge of her hood. You're absolutely right, she said. I should have been clearer about who I am. The hood fell back, and Elias's glass of Centaurian whiskey slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers. It hit the transparent floor without breaking, rolling away toward the stellar vista, forgotten. Her face was human, or nearly so. High cheekbones, full lips, eyes that caught the nebula light and reflected it back like polished stone. Beautiful, objectively, undeniably beautiful in the way that would have made his entire presentation seem hypocritical if he'd been capable of that level of self-awareness in the moment. But it was her ears that stopped his breath. Long, elegant, rising to delicate points, they marked her as unmistakably other. Athelian. One of the supposedly mythical species that human diplomats whispered about but had never successfully contacted. And then, as if her revealed face weren't enough, something else materialized. A circlet, appearing from the folds of her cloak or perhaps from nowhere at all, settling onto her brow with the weight of authority. It wasn't ornate, Athelians didn't do gaudy, but it glowed with a soft, internal light that made the expensive holograms around the deck look like carnival tricks. The entire observation deck had gone silent. The message arrived at 0600 station time, delivered by a service drone that had somehow bypassed Elias's locked door and was hovering 6 inches from his face when he woke. He'd spent the night staring at his ceiling, replaying the moment on the observation deck with the clarity of someone whose brain refused to offer the mercy of forgetfulness. Dr. Elias Reeve, the drone chirped in its pleasant, sexless voice, you are cordially invited to private chambers 7 Alpha at 0900 hours. Attendance is requested by Her Serene Highness, Crown Princess Lyra Ethan of the Athelian Sovereignty. Formal attire is not required. Punctuality is appreciated. The drone deposited a physical card, actual paper, which probably cost more than his monthly salary, and zipped away before Elias could ask it any of the 17 questions crowding his mind. He held the card up to the morning light filtering through his small viewport. The paper felt alive somehow, warm and slightly textured, with script that seemed to shift between languages as he watched. Currently it read the same message the drone had delivered, but he could have sworn a moment ago it had been in a writing system he didn't recognize. Well, he said to his empty room, at least she didn't have me arrested. The shower in his quarters provided water that was technically recycled from the station's life support system, a fact he tried not to think about as he stood under the spray. His hands shook slightly as he dressed, choosing his least wrinkled shirt and a jacket that didn't have coffee stains on the cuffs. The mirror showed him a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in one night, which seemed about right. The diplomatic level of Kepler 7 was a place Elias had never had reason to visit. It existed in that stratosphere of the station where decisions got made that affected billions of lives, where people spoke in careful euphemisms and every conversation was really three conversations happening simultaneously. The corridors here had actual carpet, a absurd luxury on a space station where every gram mattered. The walls displayed slowly shifting artwork that he suspected was worth more than most planetary GDPs. Chamber 7 Alpha sat at the end of a quiet hallway. Two figures flanked the door, and Elias's academic brain immediately catalogued them as Athelian guards despite never having seen an Athelian guard before. They wore simple uniforms of deep blue, and their ears, those distinctive, elegant ears, were the only obvious indication they weren't human. That and the fact that they stood with a stillness that suggested they could remain motionless for hours without discomfort. Dr. Reeve, the one on the left said. "You're expected." The door opened without him touching it, and Elias stepped into a room that made him immediately reassess everything he thought he knew about Athelian culture. Books. Actual, physical books, hundreds of them, lining shelves that covered 2 walls from floor to ceiling. A massive desk held what looked like star charts rendered in holographic light, but with notations in that same flowing script from the invitation. One wall had been converted into a viewport showing not the nebula but what he assumed was Athelia itself, a world of impossible crystal spires rising from forests that glowed with bioluminescence even in what appeared to be daylight. Princess Lyra stood near the desk, now dressed in something that looked comfortable rather than regal. Simple pants, a loose shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. The circlet was gone, though he could see it resting on the desk like a sleeping cat. "Dr. Reeve," she said. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the early hour, but I'm told human academics function best in the morning when properly caffeinated. I've taken the liberty of having coffee prepared, though I confess I find the beverage utterly baffling." She gestured to a low table where a service drone had deposited what looked like a professional espresso setup. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and despite everything, the humiliation, the fear, the bone-deep certainty that his career was about to be terminated, Elias felt his mouth water. "You didn't have me summoned here to discuss coffee," he said, trying for dignity and landing somewhere near exhausted resignation. "No," Lyra agreed. "Though I am genuinely curious about humanity's dependence on stimulants. We have something similar on Athelia, but it's a flower tea that induces mild euphoria rather than alertness. Different priorities, I suppose." She moved to pour 2 cups with the easy competence of someone who'd practiced. Elias accepted his and took a sip, finding it perfectly prepared. Which somehow made everything worse. "I attended your lecture," Lyra said, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for him to do the same, "because the Athelian Council is considering a formal cultural exchange program with human academic institutions. Your work on aesthetic bias and first contact protocols was recommended by 3 separate sources. I wanted to hear your ideas directly, without the filter of diplomatic channels or official delegations." Elias sat, clutching his coffee like a life preserver. "So you came in disguise to test me?" "No." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "I came in disguise because I'm tired of being treated like a museum piece. Every room I enter officially, people perform. They show me what they think I want to see, tell me what they think I want to hear. I wanted to experience a human academic symposium as a participant, not as royalty. And instead you got insulted by an arrogant professor who didn't bother to learn your name before dismissing you." "Yes," Lyra said simply. "That is what happened. The ship didn't look like a ship, which Elias supposed was the point. Lyra's personal vessel resembled something between a teardrop and a seed pod, its surface shifting between silver and opalescent white depending on the angle of the light. It sat in the private docking bay like a piece of alien jewelry, completely out of place among the utilitarian human shuttles and cargo transports. "It's alive," Lyra said, watching his face. "Partially, anyway. Athelian bioengineering. The hull is a synthetic organism that responds to stellar radiation, self-repairs minor damage, and frankly has better personality than most pilots I've worked with." Elias walked closer, reaching out before he could stop himself. The surface felt warm, almost like skin, with a texture that reminded him of polished stone. Does it have a name? Whisper. She tends to be quiet during jumps, which I appreciate. Some of the military vessels hum during quantum transitions and it drives me absolutely mad. The interior continued the theme of organic technology that made Elias's engineering degree feel quaint. The walls curved in ways that shouldn't have been structurally sound but obviously were, embedded with what looked like veins of light that pulsed gently. Seating emerged from the floor as they entered, forming itself to human proportions with an uncomfortable level of accuracy. "She's scanning you," Lyra explained, settling into her own seat near the forward viewport. "Learning your dimensions, your weight distribution, your temperature preferences. By the end of the journey she'll know you better than your physician." That's either reassuring or deeply unsettling. Both, usually. Lyra's fingers moved across a control surface that appeared at her touch, running through what looked like pre-flight checks. Fair warning, quantum slipstream travel affects humans differently than it affects us. Some people find it nauseating. Others report a strange sense of déjà vu. One human ambassador told me it felt like being unzipped and re-zipped very quickly. And you chose not to lead with that information because if I'd told you before you agreed to come, you might have reconsidered, and then I'd have been stuck explaining to the council why their potential human liaison ran screaming back to his comfortable academic office. The ship lifted without any sense of movement, which was somehow worse than feeling acceleration. Through the viewport, Kepler 7 station began shrinking with impossible speed, the nebula wheeling around them as Whisper oriented toward empty space. "How long is the journey?" Elias asked, watching stars streak past as they accelerated toward jump speed. "In objective time?" "About 6 hours. Subjectively, it varies. I once had a passenger who swore the trip took 3 days, though the chronometers proved otherwise. Human perception and quantum mechanics don't always agree on the passage of time. You're really selling this experience." "I prefer informed consent to comfortable lies. Now hold on, the transition can be abrupt." The universe folded. That was the only way Elias could describe it later. Space didn't so much move as origami itself around them, dimensions tucking into each other like a napkin being folded by invisible hands. Colors existed that he didn't have names for, sounds that he felt rather than heard. For a moment, or an hour, or no time at all, he was absolutely certain he could see the mathematical framework underlying reality itself, all the elegant equations that held everything together. Then it stopped, and he was sitting in his seat breathing hard, his coffee somehow still in his hand and not spilled despite the fact that he was fairly sure his arms had briefly existed in 4 spatial dimensions. "That was horrible," he gasped. "That was the easy part," Lyra said cheerfully. "We do that about 40 more times before we reach Athelia." "I've made a terrible mistake." "Almost certainly. But you're committed now, so you might as well enjoy the view." The hours that followed developed a strange rhythm. Jump, recover, drink water from containers that Whisper helpfully provided, jump again. Between transitions, Lyra proved to be surprisingly easy company. She asked questions about human culture with genuine curiosity, laughing when he described faculty meetings as ritualized combat with bad coffee, and looking genuinely puzzled when he tried to explain academic tenure. "So you spend years proving your worth," she said slowly, "and then once you achieve tenure, you can't be easily removed, which means some people simply stop trying." That's a cynical but not inaccurate summary. But why not just evaluate everyone continuously on merit? Because that would be terrifying and exhausting and would turn every day into a performance review. Tenure means you can take intellectual risks without worrying that one unpopular paper will cost you everything. Or it means you can coast on past achievements while contributing nothing. Also true. It's a deeply flawed system that's somehow better than every alternative we've tried. Lyra laughed, a sound that seemed to make Whisper's internal lights brighten slightly. "Humanity is nothing if not committed to imperfect solutions," says the representative of a civilization that's apparently been watching us like a cosmic nature documentary. We prefer to think of it as cautious observation. Your species has a concerning tendency toward self-destruction. We wanted to see if you'd survived your adolescence before introducing ourselves formally. And have we survived our adolescence? The jury is still out. You've avoided nuclear annihilation and haven't yet destroyed your biosphere beyond recovery, which puts you ahead of several other species we've observed. But you're also the only intelligent species we've encountered that invented social media before achieving interstellar travel, which suggests deeply questionable priorities. Elias found himself laughing despite everything. We contain multitudes. You contain chaos. It's part of your charm. Between jumps, she showed him star charts of Athelian space, vast networks of systems connected by quantum corridors that her people had mapped over millennia. She explained the Council of Voices, the governing body that had maintained peace through philosophy rather than force for longer than human civilization had existed. Athelia appeared through the viewport like a promise made solid, its crystal cities catching the light of 3 moons and scattering it across clouds that moved in patterns too perfect to be natural. Elias pressed his hand against the warm surface of Whisper's hull and tried to remember how to breathe properly. The council convenes in an hour, Lyra said, and for the first time since leaving Kepler 7, he heard tension in her voice. They'll want to hear from you directly about the cultural exchange proposal. They'll want to dissect me as evidence of human inadequacy, you mean? Some of them, yes. Counselor Theron has been arguing for decades that humanity isn't ready for formal contact. Your behavior at the symposium gave him approximately 50 years of ammunition. Whisper descended through atmosphere that tasted like electricity and landed in a courtyard where trees grew in spiral patterns, their trunks transparent enough to see the luminous sap moving through them. Guards waited, not the ceremonial kind but the sort who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of looking polite while being absolutely lethal. The council chamber defied every expectation Elias had built during the journey. He'd imagined something grand, intimidating, designed to make visitors feel small. Instead he found a circular room with walls that showed star fields, simple chairs arranged without hierarchy, and 9 Athelians who watched his entrance with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. Dr. Elias Reeve, said an older male with silver threading through his dark hair and ears that had the slightly weathered look of extreme age. I am Counselor Theron. Princess Lyra has spoken eloquently about human potential for growth and partnership. I remain unconvinced. That's fair, Elias said, and watched surprise flicker across several faces. I wouldn't be convinced either if I'd watched me dismiss someone asking intelligent questions because I assumed ignorance based on nothing but my own arrogance. Theron leaned forward slightly. You admit fault easily. Is this genuine insight or performance? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure anymore. 3 days ago I knew exactly who I was. Brilliant professor, expert in xenocultural studies, champion of evaluating beings without prejudice. Then I met someone I assumed was nobody important and proved I'm exactly as biased as the people I mock in my lectures. So either I've grown as a person or I'm trying very hard to avoid galactic embarrassment. Both can be true simultaneously. A younger counselor with laugh lines around her eyes made a sound that might have been approval. He's honest, at least. That's more than we get from most human diplomats. Honesty without wisdom is just loud ignorance, Theron countered. Dr. Reeve, why should we trust your species with cultural exchange when your leading academics can't even manage basic respect? Elias looked at Lyra, who sat at her place in the circle with her expression carefully neutral, offering no help. He realized suddenly that this wasn't about the council evaluating humanity. This was about whether he could stand in front of people who had forgotten more than he'd ever learn and admit that everything he thought he knew might be wrong. You shouldn't trust us, he said finally. Not unconditionally. We're arrogant and tribal and we make the same mistakes repeatedly while congratulating ourselves on our progress. I've spent 15 years studying alien cultures and I still defaulted to assuming someone who challenged me must be less intelligent than me. That's not a personal failing. It's a species-wide habit. Then why pursue this partnership? Another counselor asked. If you believe humanity is fundamentally flawed. Because every species you've mentioned observing was also fundamentally flawed, and some of them apparently nuked themselves into extinction while others figured it out. The difference isn't whether you're flawed. It's whether you can recognize the flaws and choose to do better anyway. Theron's expression hadn't changed. Pretty words. You humans excel at pretty words. What evidence do you offer that you'll actually change? None, Elias said. I can't offer evidence of something that hasn't happened yet. All I can tell you is that 3 days ago, I humiliated someone in front of my peers and felt justified doing it. Today I'm standing in front of the oldest civilization in known space admitting I was wrong. That's not proof of species-wide transformation, but it's proof that individual humans can learn. Sometimes. If we're lucky and someone bothers to teach us. The silence that followed felt like being evaluated by the universe itself. Then Lyra spoke, her voice carrying the weight of formal address. The Council must decide whether humanity's capacity for growth outweighs our capacity for harm. I've brought Dr. Reeve here not as a perfect example but as an honest one. He represents what we are, flawed, proud, capable of both casual cruelty and genuine insight. If we wait for humans to be perfect before engaging, we'll wait forever. The question is whether imperfection disqualifies connection. Theron stood, his movements deliberate. I have argued against this partnership for 73 years. I have watched humans stumble through first contact after first contact, offending everyone they meet while insisting they mean well. I have catalogued your wars, your prejudices, your stunning capacity for self-destruction. He paused, and something in his ancient eyes might have been amusement. But I've also watched you send music into space hoping someone would hear it. I've seen you weep over fictional stories. I've observed your ridiculous determination to explore despite having barely figured out how to leave your own planet. You're infuriating. You're also possibly the most entertainingly chaotic species we've encountered in millennia. Is that a yes? Elias asked, then immediately regretted speaking. It's a provisional approval for limited cultural exchange, pending review in 5 years, with the understanding that if humanity uses this opportunity to export your terrible coffee and worse reality television, we reserve the right to terminate contact immediately. The younger counselor laughed outright. Theron, did you just make a joke? I've been practicing. Dr. Reeve's presence inspired me to try humor as a teaching tool. How did I do? Needs work, Elias said, grinning despite himself. Later, standing on a balcony overlooking the eternal twilight that was Athelia's natural state, Lyra joined him with 2 cups of that flower tea she'd mentioned. It tasted like starlight and made everything feel slightly more possible than it should. You did well in there, she said. I admitted to being a disaster of a human being. Yes, but you did it eloquently and with genuine self-awareness. That's about as much as we can ask. She paused, watching the city lights pulse in patterns that might have been communication or art or both. For what it's worth, I didn't attend your lecture to trap you. I really was there to learn. And instead you got a masterclass in academic arrogance. I got proof that even brilliant people can be blind to their own biases. That's valuable too. It means change is possible, even for the certain. She smiled, her ears catching the light. Besides, watching you realize who I was remains the most entertaining moment of my year. The way your face went through approximately 17 emotions in 3 seconds was remarkable. I'm glad my humiliation amused you. That's what friends are for. Also colleagues. Also representatives of vastly different civilizations trying to build bridges across impossible distances. She raised her cup. To imperfect partnerships and the hope that we're both better for trying. Elias touched his cup to hers, the sound like crystal singing. Below them, the city of eternal twilight hummed with 10,000 years of patient wisdom, and somewhere in that vastness, 2 civilizations prepared to meet each other honestly for the first time.